5, 6, 7, 8.
Hi EXers, welcome to the EX Podcast episode number 62. This is your host, Stefano Vincent. I'm here today with you because we need to shake things up in the world of HR, talent acquisition, and company culture in order to create positive employee experiences in our organizations. Your workplace doesn't have to be a dreadful place where employees feel disengaged. This podcast brings a different lens to the HR, employee engagement, and company culture conversation. We approach these topics from a brand and customer experience perspective rather than a traditional HR perspective. Our guests, all thought leaders and disruptors in the EX space in their own way, come to this show to share best practices on the key elements that foster employee engagement and strengthen company culture, and also to spark the conversation on how to create those positive employee experiences. Not every company can do what Airbnb or Google do around their employee experience, and this is what this show is all about. Sharing stories of companies of all sizes, not only to show that EX doesn't require a large budget or large team, but also that there isn't one recipe. Each company can find its own way through the EX journey. Today's guest is Alexis Smith. She is the Director of Employer Branding and Digital for North America at Anheuser Busch. Today with Alexis, we talk about what are the similarities and differences between a product brand and an employer brand, and how some of the tactics differ. Where she started, what she focused on earlier on in the process, and how the EB function has evolved for the past 2.5 years. What are some of the key metrics she has put in place to measure the success of Anheuser Busch's employer brand? And how she works with more traditional HR professionals in the employer branding space. And finally, how she leverages technology, automation, and social media in her role. This episode is brought to you by Spring International. Spring is a women-owned boutique firm that focuses on performance-based employee engagement and people analytics. From onboarding to exit, Spring uses proven techniques to help companies improve the employee experience and calculate the ROI of HR programs and initiatives. I hope you enjoy this conversation. And because it takes a good amount of time to produce this podcast, please make sure to review the podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, TuneIn, or YouTube, as it would help promote the content. If you want me to speak at your next events, get some advice on your EX initiatives, or send me feedback, suggestions for future topics or guests, you can reach me at svincent@exsummit.com or on Twitter at EX_summit. All right, let's get to it. Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the EX Podcast. Today's guest is Alexis Smith, calling from New York City, and she is the Director of Employer Branding and Digital North America at Anheuser Busch. Alexis, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me, Stefan.
Very easy question for the first question. What is your background and what led you to your role at AB?
So I'm very proud of actually been at Anheuser Busch and Labatt, which is the Canadian company, for the last 10 years. And what I studied in school was international business and marketing. But I actually joined the organization through a cross-functional leadership program, which is called our Global Management Trainee Program, 10 years ago. And what that gave me is a really diverse set of experiences within the organization. So I'll spare the details of, the last 10 years of my career and development and how I ended up here, but to highlight just a few, I've started and I've worked everywhere from our Montreal brewery, working in supply and the quality department, including taste testing, to working on sales teams, brand marketing, experiential, digital media, sponsorship, trade marketing, And then most recently have made the move over to the HR team, or what we call the people team internally. So most of my experience is the marketing side, but I've been really fortunate to build a career that has a lot of different experiences within different areas of the business, which I think now that I've ended up and found myself in the HR team has given me a different level of empathy and a different level of relatability and understanding of the organization as a whole and how it connects, but also how these different functional areas live together, whether that's in our business or in other businesses.
It's quite an interesting background because usually, people working in the realm of HR come from a more traditional HR background. It's very interesting that you've had a history or in a background and experience in sales and marketing, and now you're moving into the HR, sort of HR area, but bringing your marketing expertise into that space.
Yeah, it is a different background. And I think what's interesting is it's not one that I would have expected for myself. One of the interesting things that I love about the company and that has been really exciting over my 10 years in my career thus far is that 6 out of the 8 roles, that I've held in my time here are roles that didn't exist before I took them. Which is really exciting because it truly gives me this ability to feel like an owner in the business. It gives me the ability to be an entrepreneur. It gives me the ability to define things and to create new space. So employer brand is actually a really good example of that. So one of the reasons why, if you had asked me early in my career if I'd end up here, I would have said, no, is because the role didn't exist until I took it. So part of how I ended up in this role is that our head of people back in January of 2016 actually approached me while I was leading creative for Michelob Ultra, which is the fastest growing beer brand in the United States. And he said to me, would you be interested in moving over to the people team? And I said, well, what is the role? Help me understand what is the opportunity? Because even in my mind, I was having difficulty, connecting the dots on what my experience or coming, not having any HR background, like what the purpose was or what, skill set he saw in me that he thought would be beneficial. And one of the things he said is we want you to create the employer brand function. And one of the things, the primary focus of employer brand for him at the time was to help lead recruiting initiatives and how we recruit on campus, because campus is a major part of our recruiting initiatives. So what's interesting about that is I think that's really interesting. I definitely think there's huge opportunity to increase the experiential nature and the creative side and to make the recruiting process in general a little bit more fun, interesting, creative, especially as a beer company when people know us for exciting events, exciting, communication, marketing, advertising. It's like that hasn't historically spilled over as well into our corporate or recruiting initiatives. So that was an automatic fit, and I could understand where there was value to that. But one of the things that was really important to me as well is I actually took that back. And the first thing I did when I said, thank you for the opportunity. Let me think about this and wrap my head around it a little bit. So I got home and Googled employer brand. And in January 2016, surprisingly, there was not a definition readily available just, at the top of my Google search, which got me really excited because it meant it was another role that I could influence and try to define on my own. Right. So I did some benchmarking, but I went back to what I know. So whether that, is good or bad, I went back and I said, what I do know is that if I remove the employer part of employer brand, what it leaves me with is brand. And suddenly that's something I'm very familiar with, having worked on, Michelob Ultra, as I mentioned, or, international iconic beer brands such as Budweiser. Also worked on Natty Light in the US. So I have this really great opportunity and exposure to have worked on some really, really powerful and well-known iconic brands. And I said, okay, what is at the core of what makes a brand successful? There's plenty of definitions for brand online. And at the core of that is consistency. So when you're recruiting, I went back and I remember specifically staying up. I got so excited about the space and trying to define it that I found myself, down a rabbit hole, and it was 3 a.m. and I was creating a strategic plan for what I thought employer brand should be for our organization. And the way I defined it was about saying, listen, if we want to recruit more people and we want to build an employer brand, which in many organizations is predominantly focused externally and on candidates and recruiting more great talent, I think the only way to do that, or one of the most important ways, I believe, maybe not the only way, but I think a really effective way to do that is by starting by building the brand from the inside out. And so I focused on saying, okay, I want to focus on doing great things on campus, and I want to focus on innovating and adding creativity and focusing on the candidate experience for recruiting initiatives for both campus and professional hires. But I also want to look at the culture of the organization and how I can ensure that what we sell and what we deliver and the experience that our employees have here is consistent with what we're selling to candidates who are interested in joining, to ensure that when that candidate journey crosses over for successful candidates and becomes an employee journey, that there is consistency throughout that thread and that experience, and to make sure that we can actually deliver on what it is we're committing to and selling people. So that's kind of how I got into it, and that's where I was able to pull some of that marketing experience. And it's interesting because I didn't see it immediately, but hindsight, as they say, is 2020. I think what's really interesting is that marketing and HR have so much in common, because at the core, they're both about a fundamental understanding of human beliefs and behaviors. And if you can understand, why people behave a certain way, or what drives them, or what affects their impacts or their purchasing decisions or their career decisions, if you can understand that, I used to do that and understand our target market and our demographic to sell beer. And now I have to do that, one, to try to, inspire and facilitate and create an environment of engagement for our employees where they're productive and delivering great results, but also on how I can encourage people to choose us, or to think about whether or not they think they're a great fit to work for Anheuser Busch versus working for another company.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of this approach of the empathy and the understanding of your target audience, whether it's consumers or it's employees. Now, do you really believe that many companies or many HR professionals in companies really have that sense of, I wouldn't say necessarily empathy with employees, because most of the HR people actually do care about the employees they serve and they help within organizations. But I think the way they train and the way the HR function is designs doesn't really allow those professionals to really show empathy and create experiences. It's mostly designed and targeted around compliance and regulations. Don't you think?
I totally agree. So I think I'm obviously a sample size of one, and I'm working with one organization. So there's definitely a bias here, as we, within HR, we train ourselves to be mindful of conscious and unconscious bias. So I will flag that right now. But I completely agree with you that I think there's two leading factors to that. So the first one is that I think structure, and this goes beyond HR, goes beyond marketing in general in businesses today, I think that structure sometimes takes precedence over strategy. Mm-hmm. And so I think one of the reasons that drives that, if you look at HR specifically, is that you have somebody who's in charge of learning and development, and you have somebody who's in charge of engagement, you have somebody who's in charge of recruiting. And so by definition, as much as they try to integrate, I think that oftentimes we can think very siloed. So that's the first piece of it.
Yes.
The second piece of it is around skill set. And so what I find really interesting, and it was an important part of my transition between the marketing function into the HR function, is that HR's job, and I'm grossly simplifying, but one of the major objectives of HR is to find the right talent for the right roles. And part of what leads that beyond culture and some of the intangibles, or what people like to call soft skills or culture fit, is the skill set to say, are you capable of doing that job? So if we simplify for a second and look at Anheuser Busch as a brewer, we need engineers in breweries, and we need people who have the right skill set to be able to effectively brew the best beers in the world, or some of the best beers in the world. And you would never put somebody in that doesn't have at least fundamentally some of the basic skill sets, or at least the path to teach them and train them on any gaps that they have to make them successful in the role and the results they need to deliver. But what's interesting is that I think HR does that so much for every other department that in many cases HR has not done that within their own department. So if you're asking someone in HR to focus on user experience or candidate journey, et cetera, there are people who have specific skill sets and experience around just that user journey and candidate experience. Or if you want to talk about making things more experiential, or you want to talk about creating content or leading digital media strategies and paid media, et cetera, the reality is that I think part of why it's it's difficult and many HR professionals struggle is not because they're not good at it or they can't be good at it. It's because they have no experience doing it. And so I think it's just funny because, there's oftentimes a saying of like HR takes care of everybody else and then sometimes forgets to take care of themselves. But I really think that we have to take the same approach for our own teams, which is building people who have the right skill set or sourcing people who have the right skill set, whether that's the person leading the role, whether that's finding, working with your internal marketing teams to help educate and close some of those learning gaps, whether that's providing learning and development, or whether that's working with outside partners who can help bring some of that knowledge and expertise to the space versus trying to take all of that responsibility on yourself when you've maybe never done anything like that before.
Right. And what I love about the concept of the employee experience is that it allows collaboration between different entities or different teams or departments within an organization that usually work in silos. Right. And you talked earlier about consistency in the brand's experience and the journey of consumers. And that's exactly the same through the candidates to the employees and even up to the exits and being an alumni. And what I like about the sort of collaboration between different teams is, depending on how the organization is structured, oftentimes you're going to have HR that is really focused on, let's say, payroll and wellness, and then you're going to have recruiting and talent acquisition that doesn't really focus on what happens when the employees start within the company, but they focus on the recruiting and the candidates. Now you have marketing that may be only focused on the products or the services, not so much on the employer brands. Facilities that are not necessarily in the mix either. But so anyhow, the whole idea of the employee experience is really to bridge those gaps and bring people together with, as you said, different skill sets that work well together because they have a deep knowledge in certain areas, but combining them together is going to be able to develop that empathy and that experience that organizations are looking for nowadays.
I totally agree. I think that's a really great point. I think, I try to use, and forgive me, hopefully it's helpful, but I'm known for using analogies because I think that when you're working in a new space or when there's this complexity of, to your point, you have to be an expert or you have to understand or you have to work and collaborate with people from every function of the business. And that should be happening in good businesses across all teams because realistically, nothing ever gets done in any company without cross-functional collaboration because we're all, working towards the same common goals. But I think the difference is that the understanding that HR as a function needs to have and the importance of collaboration with all of these other functions is even greater because we're basically, one, everyone is our consumer, is our customer. I think that's a major difference, right? So people work in brand teams and they work on one brand and somebody works on a different brand and sometimes they're consumers of the product and sometimes they're not. So you think about a good example is outside of beer, you can have people that are leading brand strategies that are not necessarily the target market for that. But in the interest or in the example of employer brand, the funny thing is that we are all employees internally and we have all been candidates at some point. So there's a great unifier, and although we're different candidates and we've been at different levels and you can still segment us very differently, this is a universal experience. So in some way, shape, or form, we've all had this experience, different versions, different qualities of it. But I completely agree that this cross-collaboration, and I agree that the empathy needs to be there, but it's interesting because I think it's very close to home as well, which can be a good thing and a bad thing because we can take for granted that our own experience is representative of everybody's. We can also sometimes get stuck and not see the trees for the forest. So I think it's a balance between the two. Right.
Now, so we've been talking about the product brands and the employer brands. From your experience at Anheuser Busch, can you illustrate or tell us what are some of the differences and some of the similarities between running or managing a product brand versus an employer brand?
For sure. The first thing I think is important to contextualize a little bit for listeners is that I want to just explain a little bit about the branding hierarchy within Anheuser Busch.
Yes.
Because I think it's important. So we have it's also fairly unique versus some other companies. And I also think that it's important because what I'm about to say is very applicable to our business, but I want to just asterisk that I think everybody needs to look at it slightly differently based on their brand strategy. So the thing for Anheuser Busch is that we have a global parent company, which is AB InBev or Anheuser Busch InBev ABI. This is our global parent brand. Then within that global parent brand, we have a number of regional company brands. So we have Anheuser Busch in the US, and we have Labatt in Canada. We have AmBev in Brazil, in Argentina, in Brazil. We have a number of different corporate brands, right? And then one level below that, we have our consumer brands. So we have 3 levels of brand hierarchy within our organization. And most of the awareness and most of the equity and knowledge of our brands, where our brands are the strongest, are within the consumer brand side. So that's right. The Budweiser, Stella, Michelob Ultra, Goose Island, Shock Top, Bud Light, you name it. So why is that, where most of our equity sits? One, because we, that's what delivers our results as a business. That's what drives our profitability. And that's where we invest the most heavily. Why that's an important call out is because there's a number of organizations that have like a company brand and consumer brands, or will have a global parent company and they will have other companies that fall within them, but those companies are still named after consumer brands. So take PVH as an example. PVH has a global parent company, and then they have Calvin Klein, Tommy Hilfiger, et cetera, a number of different brands under that fall within. But those company brands that operate as different companies are also consumer brands.
Yes.
So getting a little bit complicated into the weeds here, but if you zoom back out, if what I'm about to say about the difference between product brand and employee brand is very important to differentiate, because I'm not called Budweiser. My company brand is not Budweiser. So to anybody listening whose company brand is one and the same with their consumer brand or their customer brand or their product brand, it's a slightly different approach. So I can touch on that. But from my perspective, what I think is really important, when you keep in mind that Anheuser Busch is not the name of a beer, it's the name of the company, and all of the beers ladder up to it. I think there's actually still more in common between product and company brands than there is differences. And I think that comes back to my, very early definition of a brand in saying, okay, one of the things that needs to be, that's common between product or employer brand is consistency.
Yes.
So brands by definition need to be executed consistently. Otherwise, they're not a brand, because a brand is about an identifier that drives an association, whether that's emotional, physical, functional, et cetera. But I have to look at a brand and understand what it is and what it represents and what I can expect of it. And that consistency is something that I think we underestimate, especially in the employer brand side. I think product brand gets very good at that and understands the importance. But I think the reason consistency is a problem for employer brand is because we have internal versus external. We have corporate versus, and communications and government affairs. And then we've got like the HR and people side of things and the recruitment side. So I think it's really important that consistency is something that in any kind of brand is super, super important. So people know, they, 1, have awareness, 2, they know what to expect and they have an accurate perception, and 3, it's consistent on where, who, when they see and experience the brand. So that's the first one. The second one is that I believe all brands, product or employer, have emotional connections. And in some cases, depending on what the product brand is, I would almost argue that there's an even greater emotional connection for employer brands, or a greater opportunity, at least, for an emotional connection, because we're talking about people's livelihood.
Yes.
And we're talking about something that we do every single day. It's something, it's very important to all of us. It has a huge impact on our lives, our friends, our families, our relationship, our lifestyle, et cetera. So I think that it's easy to say, there's some product brands, and forgive me for generalizing, but maybe people are not emotionally connected to their toilet paper. Maybe people are emotionally connected to their car. But what I think is common is that good brands should drive some form of emotional connection, whether that's, there's plenty of different emotions. I'm not talking about we need to make everybody cry here, but we have to understand that brands play an important role in people's lives, and understanding how your brand plays a role and how important people's jobs and careers are to them.
Right.
So emotional connection is number 2.
Yeah, and yes, definitely. And on the product side, it's mostly transactional. Obviously, you may have an emotional connection to it, but it's mostly transactional. And the level of commitment and engagement is not the same from a consumer to a brand versus from an employee to a company or employer.
Exactly. Exactly. I think that like commitment is definitely an important one. I say that choosing a career is up there with choosing, a partner in life or buying a house or buying a car. Like they're big decisions. They have big implications.
Yes.
You can't necessarily easily return them. In fact, it's easier probably to take your car back and you can test drive a car and you can see a house, but like sampling a career is very difficult, which we'll probably come back to later in the discussion. But I wholeheartedly agree with you. So there's this idea of commitment that helps drive that inherent emotional connection, which I think is underrepresented or I don't think we have enough empathy as employer brand or as HR to understand the emotional connection that our brands drive with people.
Right. Yes, I agree.
So then the third one I think is very much in common, and some of these things are like, there's commonalities, but there's also differences to them. So I'm answering the question of similarities and differences sort of in combination. But the third one that I think is very much in common is the importance of credibility. Mm-hmm. So I think when we talk about, one of the major differences, which we'll come to between product and employer brand, is tangibility. And I think that lack of tangibility sometimes, because it's hard for me to say, here's your career, you can touch it, you can feel it, you understand what it is, you can hold me accountable to it. The credibility is so important because, if people have a bad experience with your product, they might return it, they might never buy it again, they might go to social media. But if people have a bad experience in your business, you can't just return it. Or if they have a bad experience like working in the business, or if they thought it was going to be one way and it wasn't, it was different than what they expected, that credibility, going back to that idea of emotional connection and commitment, is very personal. And so I think it's harder in employer brand to figure out how you build credibility when you're lacking some tangibility. But I think it's a really important thing that matters because you establish trust. And if you don't establish trust, word spreads, right? Social media, the internet, et cetera, today, Glassdoors of the world, employees as brand ambassadors, that credibility of what you say you are and delivering upon it is super, super important for long-term success and building equity for your company.
For those who are maybe considering a career move and getting into the employer brand space, or for those actually who may like to even pitch the idea inside the organization to start an employer brands program within the organization, from your perspective, where do you think we should start? Or let's say, how did you start? And what did you focus on earlier on, since when you came on board, the position itself was pretty much brand new at Anheuser Busch?
Yeah, so I'm lucky in one way, in the sense that there was excitement and there was an understanding of at least at a fundamental level understanding that we needed to do employer brand. It was just a question of how and the what and what it entailed, which is where I was able to come in and influence. So I think that first initial hurdle,
yes,
I was lucky because I was approached with the opportunity, right?
Yeah.
What I would say is this, is that in almost all organizations, and I'm quickly racking my brain to think if there's any exceptions to it, but whether you're a product company or whether you're a service company, whether you're B2B or B2C, the reality is that pretty much every company, if not all companies, has a sales and marketing department.
Yes.
And the reason they have that is to build a strategy so that it's clear and concise and targeted and valuable in what it is they're selling or what they're trying to get people to buy into. And so if I hadn't been approached with the opportunity and I had the foresight, as a marketer to see this need and this demand for employer brand without being introduced to it, I would start there, because I do think even for myself, it's sometimes hard to wrap your head around new space and how to create and innovate it, because it's easy to fall back into what we know. And so I spend a lot of time looking at comparing to other things that are not employer brand to understand how they work, and then take those learnings and apply them back and say, could this also work? Could this logic apply to employer brand? And so I think when you're pitching it internally, the question becomes ROI, which I know we'll end up getting into. It's one of the hottest topics of discussion within employer brand. It's also one of the biggest differences, to be fair, just to follow back up on that last question, between product, because we have very robust systems around analyzing, measuring, tracking our products, because they're driving the profitability of our organizations. But I think we're a little bit behind, or many organizations are behind in that same sophisticated availability of data to measure in different ways beyond, turnover, retention, time to hire, vacancy, number of roles, headcount, salary, all that kind of stuff. So I think what I would say, though, is, you couldn't be successful in selling your product if you didn't have a brand strategy, or a clear understanding of what exactly it is, to be able to make it tangible. So if you want to compare an employer brand even to a service, which is not as tangible as like a physical product, you still have to be able to find a way to convey, this is what my service offers, this is what it will do for you. And then you will be held accountable to make sure that the service you're delivering aligns with that. The same way, if you say, this is what our company culture is about, this is what we do, this is what you can expect when you join, you should be held accountable to making sure that people's experience when they get here is aligned with what you said. So I think when you remove yourself out of HR and employer brand, and you start looking at other examples specifically in your business, which keeps it hyper relevant for your senior leaders and stakeholders, you say, well, imagine if we didn't do this for our product. Imagine if we didn't do this for our service. How would we sell it? And if, I find that question, and most people I've spoken to find that question very difficult to answer. So that brings you back to, then, how do I sell the company? Or how do I keep people being, brand loyal, AKA how do I retain talent, if I don't have some of these basic skills that work in every other, format of sales and marketing and getting people to buy in? Because we have to remind ourselves that, yes, people are employees, but they are humans first and foremost,
right?
And they are employees. So what works for them in every other facet of life, in theory, should also be leveraged to what works for them from a work and career standpoint as well.
Yeah, and they usually say that competition nowadays is really no longer about products, but mostly about talents, right? And when you think of this, many of the products or services are just commoditized, and it's very easy to compare from one to another. It's very easy to switch from one to another, and brand loyalty is no longer a secure thing. What is really critical is what type of talents you bring to the organization, so that you're going to bring more innovation, better productivity, higher productivity, better customer service, or whatever it might be. So in your 2.5 years that you've been in this role, how has the employer brand evolved at AB, and what do you see happening in the next maybe year or 2 years ahead?
Yeah, so the first year that I started, and I think the most important thing, in today's world, regardless of what your company is and regardless of what your role is, I think one thing that most of us can probably relate to is the need for speed. So we're inundated, things happen quickly with emails, social media. We push ourselves really hard to drive and implement things very quickly. And I think that sometimes that need for speed distracts us from really truly understanding business problems and building strategies that directly will influence them. We sometimes get into check the box. So even when I joined my role, one of the things people said is, we need content. And I said, pause. We don't actually need any more content, because producing content is expensive and it's timely, and to do it well is very, very difficult. So can anybody produce a video? Yes, especially today with iPhones and technology. Literally anyone can record a video. That doesn't mean that a video is going to be good quality. It doesn't mean that it's going to actually be effective in solving any of your business gaps. And it doesn't mean that it is going to convey the message or be seen or reach the people that you want it to reach. So one of the things that I recommend and that I started with is, I come with a marketing background, but I was new to HR. And so I think I needed to be humble in understanding the problem first. So the first year, the first 6 months was very much about research and understanding the problem and understanding or the opportunity and understanding the gaps and what I needed to focus on, because inevitably in most situations, there's always more to do than you have time or resources, and you need to prioritize. So one of the ways that we did that was we did a lot of internal interviews in addition to our engagement surveys and the data that we already had. We had interviews with students and surveys with students. We bought research reports and rankings. And then we also did one-to-one interviews with a number of influential cultural brand, influencers within the space. So people like the Patty McCords from Netflix as an example of just one of them. So we interviewed a lot of them to kind of get the lay of the land. And so year one was very much about research and wrapping our head around the problem, or again, the opportunities, not always problems. And one of the first things we did is I think I still needed to find low-hanging fruit. So one of the things I did is I worked on bringing my knowledge of website and web development and design, and I helped make the website, better than it was. So that was like my ability to get to know the problem and the situation better, to educate myself and inform myself with the data. And then also to still give some of those quick wins that felt like we were moving forward and there were some tangible things that we could say, look what we did, this is great progress and we're moving forward. The second year, what we focused on is we actually, I did an RFP process, a request for proposal to figure out who my agency partner could be, because we had a very small team of limited resources internally. And I think our perspective internally is very valuable because nobody understands better than us what it's like to work here and what we're looking for in new candidates. But we also, having a fresh perspective is also really, really helpful, because if they have trouble understanding what we're trying to convey, then chances are potential candidates will also have a problem understanding it. So we did a request for proposal. We had a number of different agencies present, and then I actually hired and awarded the business to a creative agency out of Brooklyn called Huge. And they're a phenomenal agency. The purpose for that was because I wanted to make sure that, I had a broader set of experiences, not just our, small team internally, but also people with expertise within the space to define what do we stand for?
Right.
What are our brand values? What's important? What is the sort of the blue, before we try to build the house of employer brand, and what are the blue, et cetera. And a lot of companies will refer to this as an EVP. So the one thing I just want to pause on when it comes down to EVP or employee value proposition is that I think the one challenge a lot of people have with EVPs is it's very much a buzzword. It's something that everybody feels they have to do. It's the foundation of employer brand.
Yeah.
The challenge that I have as a marketer with EVPs is that from my experience, again, sample size of one, so I know there are people that probably have very different outputs and experiences, but from my personal experience, oftentimes what an EVP is very, very basic visual guidelines. Here's the logo, here's some colors, whatever. And then in addition to that, there's usually like a paragraph or a few paragraphs that's almost more like a manifesto or a mission statement. Do I think that's great? Yes. But the problem is I don't know how, and most people struggle to say, how do I take a manifesto or a number of paragraphs and sentences and actually translate that into execution? And that's why in the brand world, we don't do that. We start by saying, what are the values? Like one word values. What is the tone? What is the personality? And we almost define the brand as if it was a person, so that we can create a very tangible example of, like, we can envision what that person looks like. Because if you start talking about a value instead of a manifesto, or if you talk about one word instead of paragraphs as an example, for example, we have empowerment as a key value of ours. Suddenly I can start to see how it's much easier for me to gut check any ideas we have about implementing about what empowerment is and how we're bringing it to life.
Right, exactly.
So let me pay that off with like something a little bit more tangible. As an example, when I started using a simple, website design, we had a jobs page and we had a corporate page. So at the time, we actually had a website that was called bushjobs.com, or we also had a vanity URL directing to it that's called budweiserjobs.com. Both landed on the same website. And that website was separate from anheuserbusch.com. Now, there's a number of companies that actually do have a separate job site from a separate company site or corporate site. And I think one of the best examples of that is when people's consumer brand is also their company brand. But to keep it as high level and to not overcomplicate as much as I can, the reality is that what we talked about is empowerment. So what is more empowering to me is that I can learn about the company in one place and also apply for a job in one place, because you're giving me all the resources I need to feel empowered to educate myself, to understand not only what it could be like to work for you, but what your perspective is on community involvement and CSR and Better World initiatives, and also like what brands fall in your portfolio and what your culture is like and what your results are as an organization. And once I've done all of that, I'm right there and empowered and educated to be able to apply for a job. So it's this goes back to that idea of sometimes structure, leads instead of strategy, because we might have two different teams internally from a comms and a people standpoint, but everybody in the outside world is experiencing the same story published in two different books, right? Two different websites. So that seems like a silly example, but that's a perfect example where it's like, okay, I can now understand how empowerment comes down to how do we teach people to fish? Instead of me having to tell you where to go or tell you what it's like, how do I just give you the resources easily for you to figure them out for yourself? Because that's ultimately what empowerment is all about. So I couldn't have done that with the employee value proposition because there was just too much there. Can I write it on a website? Sure, but can I actually pull things out that inspire strategic decisions and prioritization? A little bit less difficult. So we established that brand foundation, and then just to wrap up your original question, which was what did we do to get started and what approach did we use? We then worked, and I actually briefed my agency, and because our approach at the time was to say I want to build the brand from the inside out. And the other reason why I believe in that, not only because it drives the consistency we talked about, which is important for brands, but I think we underestimate sometimes, because we recruit and we spend so much of our time hiring new people in HR, how hiring people actually impacts the overall culture of the organization and it affects your current employees. So I really didn't want, from an empathy standpoint, our employees to feel like we spend more time communicating to candidates than we spend on what we communicate to them. Because we take for granted, even if you look at, you invest media spend and you invest all this money in targeting candidates and recruiting candidates, but then you only send email communications out to your internal employees. And maybe they're not as creatively well thought out. Now, that's not for every company. I think there's a number of companies that are very good at that. But I wanted to make sure that in recruiting more people, it didn't make our current employees, which, by the way, is the bulk of people, right? So we have approximately 23,000 employees working in the US and Canada. So I need to focus on them because they're my largest audience. Right. And how can I leverage them to help me with my initiatives, but while still feeling like they're an important and valued asset within the business, not just we're looking for, the future leaders and to fill gaps. So we built this campaign, and my brief to my creative agency was, I want you to come up with an external tagline or campaign that helps identify us and closes the gaps that we had identified in year one, which is we have an awareness gap. So for anybody listening who's a small brand or a startup who feels like, oh, you guys maybe have challenges with awareness, newsflash, we're a 160-year-old American icon, and we still have gaps with awareness on Anheuser Busch. There are people that don't know that Anheuser Busch is even a beer company. So everything is relative, and I can certainly relate. But we shared that information with them and said, okay, I need to drive awareness, but then I also want what we use as external communication to feel like a rally cry internally. And the output of that was we launched a campaign called We Are All Brewers. And so it leads all of our creative assets, it leads our narrative and our messaging, and it acts as something that is a rally cry that we can be proud of internally that brings us all together across functions, locations, et cetera, but then is also something that helps close the gap on Anheuser Busch, We Are All Brewers. We're here with an info session opportunity. We have open jobs, apply now. Helps drive that connection of, well, what is Anheuser Busch? Oh, they're a brewer. So that for us was a really important part of the campaign. So basically learn your problems, understand your gaps, understand where your opportunities are, and find the data to back it up. Then prioritize, find a partner or figure out what your creative strategy is, build that architecture or the blueprints, and then work on executing it and then measuring the impact that it's having on closing the gaps you identified in the first place.
So let's talk a bit more about measurements, because product marketing is obviously pretty heavy on metrics and measurements. Again, the employer brand being new in many organizations, many of them have not mastered yet the measurement component of it. What are some of the key metrics that you've put in place to measure the success of your employer brand's initiatives?
This is the most common discussion, and it's one of my greatest pain points and what keeps me up at night. So I will admittedly, before I provide the answer to that, say we haven't totally cracked the code yet, for full transparency. I think one of the challenges is that the life cycle in measuring ROI and employer brand is substantially longer than it is for product. Mm-hmm. So if I invest in a media campaign, or in our case, a Super Bowl ad, and I fill stores and there's lots of beer and product available and it's priced competitively, and I do a lot of promotion around it, I should be able to see, in a fairly short period of time, the impact of that investment in that campaign on how it resulted in sales and volume and profitability. The challenge that I think we have is there's a few things that employer brands should affect and that I would love to be able to measure. But there's a lot of noise that you need to remove as well. So I think it definitely affects, and if you define it the way we do and you focus on how employer brand affects internal engagement in your current employees, you want to measure engagement. You also want to measure, is it helping close any awareness gaps that you have? Does it help close any consideration gaps? Does it also, if more people know about you and more people consider working for you, that's a great start to the funnel because you need a certain amount of volume, but you also want to minimize waste. So you want to minimize it, and that's a terrible word to say when we're talking about careers and talent and candidates, so apologies for the use of that word. But we want to minimize people applying who are maybe not the right fit. So going back to our brand values of empowerment, I would much rather educate you about who we are so that you can be like, yes, I think I'm a great fit for that and I want to be there and I think I could be successful individually and add value to the business. And if you're not the right fit, that's totally fine. In fact, it would be better for both the company side from an efficiency standpoint and also from the candidate side from a mindfulness and respect of their time, that they could identify that early on in the process instead of having gone through rounds and rounds of interviews, applications, culture tests, logical reasoning, all that kind of stuff. So we measure that stuff, but I think the other thing is I really think that measuring tangible ROI on employer brand is a multi-year process. Mm-hmm. Because I want to know, did we close awareness gaps? Did we close consideration? Did we increase the number of people who are applying and want to work for us? At the same time, did the quality increase?
Exactly.
So did we send more offers? Did more people accept their offers? And then also tying back in when it goes from candidate to employee experience and journey is, were the people we hired after we started these initiatives more successful in the business? Mm-hmm. Did they stay longer? So the life cycle of ROI is very long. So we have not yet fully measured that because I need a few years to be able to see how the full journey goes. In the short term, though, we're not sitting here twiddling our thumbs, not measuring anything. So here's a few things directly to answer on what we do measure that I think is helpful. So we obviously invest in social media dollars. And I shouldn't say obviously, we invest in social media dollars. And for anyone listening with an HR background that is not familiar in social media investment, this may sound common sense to a number of you, but there is no such thing as organic reach anymore. So nothing that you put out, whether it's a job posting or whether it is, a video or a content or a social post, will get reach to anybody, including the followers on your page, organically, unless you're investing behind it. The algorithms and social media, all of that has changed. And I think that was something that, a number of people in HR, when I moved into the function, were a little bit surprised by. So social media, number one, is mandatory. So for every, or digital media or media investment in general is mandatory. If you're investing in creating content, whether that's $1 or $100,000 or whatever your budget is, you need to ensure that at a bare minimum, for every dollar you spend on creating stories or creating content and messages, you're spending $1 on making sure people actually see them. Right. The benefit of media is that you ensure that the right people are seeing it. So I don't need everybody to see us. I need people that we think are going to be the right fit. Or if I'm looking for jobs in a certain city, I need them to see it. I don't need somebody in New York to see that we're looking for a job in LA, as an example. So So social media is super important. What that comes with is it helps close the gap on having very trackable and tangible things. So things we measure: impressions, how many people saw it, how many times did they see it? So this is an idea of reach and frequency. How many people saw it, and then how many times did they see it? Because nobody in anything remembers something once, right? So you have to remember that, whether that's internal communications, whether that's candidate selection and recruitment, whether that's selling a product, people need to see things multiple times. The second one is engagement. So did they do anything with it? Did they watch the video? Did they watch the full video? Did they drop off after 10 seconds? Did they share it? Did they comment, etc.? And then sentiment is another really good one to measure. So we actually will track and measure what people are saying or how they're reacting to it. And we will say, is it positive sentiment or is it negative sentiment?
Right.
Because that helps us understand if the message is being effectively received.
Right, yeah, if it's relevant.
Exactly. Yeah. And then the second thing is engagement internally, which is an important metric to continue to measure, because you're ultimately selling culture. And if your engagement is low, whether you've decided that employer brand should focus on engagement internally or not, or if that's held separately by somebody who literally manages talent management and engagement, the reality is it's going to impact what you're doing from a brand standpoint, especially with resources and transparency of Glassdoor, people out having conversations with other people, networks, etc. So engagement's another thing that we measure. Research, data, and rankings. So there's a number of data and rankings and research that you can purchase. So understanding, I think the key is really understanding you understand the data and what it's measuring and using it in the right way. So people sometimes get lost, and ourselves included, in using rankings. If you're cutting the data a different way than a competitor is cutting the data, and then another company is cutting the data, by definition, it can't be a ranking. So that is something in the employer brand space I've found is a bit of a cyclical issue, because a ranking by definition says everything compared equally, this is where everybody stands. If you can cut it different ways, then it shouldn't be used as a ranking. It should be used as insight and research and learning. Hopefully that translates and makes sense. And then what we talked about, which is volume of candidates, quality of candidates, and then qualitative feedback, interviews, et cetera. So there's lots you can definitely measure: time to hire, et cetera. The key, though, is trying to figure out how you separate everything that you're already doing, how you separate some of the noise from, well, there just happened to be more business students this year on campus. So was that the reason why we had more people apply, or is it because our campaign and employer brand initiatives were really effective? And breaking through that noise, I think, is one of the biggest challenges that we have. And then also tracking people's career journeys from candidate to employee experience to where they end up in their careers and what results they've delivered.
And so that's quite a lot of food for thoughts here for those who actually want to be able to measure their employer brand initiatives. Since we're getting close to the end, let me just ask you some fun questions first before we wrap it up. When you were growing up as a kid, what was your dream job?
I wanted to be an actress.
Okay. All right. Drama or comedy?
I don't know, maybe both. Hopefully I was going to be, I guess, if cross-functionality has been part of my career today, I hope that I could have tread the line on both, perhaps.
All right. You're from Canada. So what are some of the differences that you've seen since you've moved to New York City from your life in Toronto? And you lived in Montreal too, right?
I did, yes. Yeah. So
how New York City differs from Canada?
I think there's a number of different ways that it differs. I think, and it's funny because there are so many commonalities as well, but there's a lot of differences. To be mindful to not get into like a political or cultural discussion, I think what I would say to that is how I've been able to leverage that experience culturally and my own personal experience to understand the differences to try to build an employer brand plan that's more that's relevant. So we all talk about our own cultures and our organizations, but I think it's super important for us to understand how culture as a whole, so culture in the US, is affecting our employees and is also affecting candidates and how they perceive us, and how we adapt and continue to stay relevant. And so I think one of the things from my perspective that is different specific to my role is that in Canada, we're very used to foreign ownership, or we're used to Canadian companies being acquired, Labatt being an example of that. So it was acquired before Anheuser Busch was. Yeah. And I think that the implications of that was different because we're a little bit more, not that we're more open to it, we're just more used to it because Canada's a smaller market. When you then fast track into the US and you think about it's America, the land of the free, like, you know, American dream is something that everybody, you know, universally can kind of relate to. And then you think about acquisition and foreign ownership, it suddenly has a different impact. And so I think that is something that I've really had to ensure that my perception and my experience in Canada is very different than how that impacts people in the US, especially in light of, you know, political discussions and what's hot topics in the news and media today. So that's super important. And then size and scale is another important one. So things take time. And when everything is, you know, arguably 10 times the size in the US, we need to understand that investment needs to be greater, but appetite for time for things to actually have the impact is going to take longer in most cases, unless you've really got all the investment and time to heavy up on it early on. So size has definitely been, as much as that's an easy one, it's definitely been something that I've had to keep in mind.
That's a good one. What is the way for our listeners to follow you and Anheuser Busch on social media?
So you can follow at Anheuser Busch on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. You can also check out our LinkedIn account and check out our website at anheuser-busch.com/careers if you're interested. And then you can follow me on LinkedIn, Alexis Smith.
Perfect. Any last word of advice or wisdom?
Yeah, I think the last thing I would just say is that what really gets me excited about this space is that there is a lot of excitement in general around employer brand and culture and innovating within HR and candidate experiences and recruitment. And I think, one, we desperately need it. And two, I think that it means that there's creating a whole new set of opportunity for what this space can be. I'm starting to have people reach out and say, I love marketing, but I'm really interested in the people side and HR. And that for me really gets me excited about the space. I'm also really excited about how we can innovate within the space. And so I want to encourage everybody to know, yes, it can be overwhelming. Yes, it can be daunting and intimidating. But when you take some risks, take some chances, and think outside the box. And one small anecdote that I'll say on what we did is we actually challenged ourselves to say, how can we go from beer sampling to career sampling? And we created an escape room as a way to sample our culture. And it was a 15-minute experience. People had the chance to come in. Complete strangers, up to 10 people would enter a room. They would have 15 minutes to tackle real business challenges that our employees have successfully overcome. And not only was it fun and it was educational and it was experiential, but it was a great way for people to get to know each other. It was, you know, a perfect experiment for diversity and inclusion to prove that the more diverse the teams were, the more effective they were solving challenges. And I think we launched it at South by Southwest and took it on a cross-country campus tour. And you can see more about that and learn more about that on my LinkedIn profile. But the key is that there's appetite for innovation in the space and to get creative. And if you're not sure where to start, find the right people and skill sets and partners to help you do that, because there's a lot of opportunity to stand out and to make a difference in what we're doing, both in HR and employer brand.
That's great. Well, thank you so much, Alexis, for being on the show and sharing some valuable insights, most definitely with our listeners. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, Stefan.
Thanks for tuning in to the EX Podcast. If you want to learn more, visit our website at expodcast.com. If you want to find out more about our next conferences, go to exsummit.com. Finally, you can also find my manifesto on business to employee or B2E branding at b2ebranding.co. See you next week.